What would you do if a simple flight turned into a battlefield of dignity, prejudice, and power? Imagine stepping onto a plane, expecting nothing more than a few quiet hours above the clouds, but instead, you're humiliated, drenched in water by the very person meant to keep you safe. The cabin gasps, eyes turn, and in that instant, you're forced to choose shrink under injustice or stand taller than ever before. This is not just the story of Naomi Carter, a woman who refused to be broken, but also of a husband who revealed a shocking truth at 37,000 feet, of passengers torn between silence and courage, and of a flight attendant whose downfall became inevitable the moment hatred spilled over into action. What really happened on Liberty Air Flight 417? How did one night in the sky expose truths far deeper than turbulence, and what will linger long after the wheels touch down in Los Angeles? Stay with us, because this story will move you, challenge you, and remind you why respect and justice matter for every human being. If you believe stories like this must be told, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The recycled air inside Liberty Air Flight 417 carried a familiar hum, the kind that could lull a passenger to sleep or remind them they were locked inside a pressurized metal tube for the next 4 hours. For most travelers, it was background noise, but for Linda Graves, the senior flight attendant, that sound was the anthem of her kingdom. For 22 years she had ruled over cabins just like this one, not kindly, not gently, but with the kind of authority that came from repetition, from years of walking these aisles, memorizing every protocol, and reminding everyone, crew and passengers alike, that she was in charge. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed so sharply it could almost cut paper. Her blonde hair was wound into a bun so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, giving her an expression of perpetual disapproval. When she moved through first class, it wasn't with the warmth of a hostess. It was the march of a warden checking cells in her luxury prison, and today she had already chosen her target. 1A, the seat by the window, the seat closest to the galley, the seat she always noticed first, Naomi Carter, a woman who carried herself with quiet elegance, dressed in a cream-colored suit that looked effortless but expensive. Her hair was styled into intricate braids, each strand glinting beneath the overhead lights. She had placed a leather-bound sketchbook on the tray table, along with a single pen. And now she sat gazing out at the tarmac as if she were seeing something the rest of the cabin could not. She had not asked for champagne. She had not fussed about the boarding process. She had not demanded anything. And yet, for Linda, her very presence was a provocation. Linda's lips curled as she whispered under her breath, just for herself, just enough to savor the bitterness. Of course, she's in first class. The words slipped out like poison, unnoticed by the passengers but sharp enough to make her younger colleague, Rachel Kim, glance up. Rachel was new to Liberty Air, fresh-faced, with an earnestness that had not yet been weathered into cynicism. She was arranging champagne flutes when she caught the senior attendant's mutter. "What was that?" "Linda," she asked gently. Linda flashed a smile that never touched her eyes. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just making sure we've got enough of the good champagne for our valued guests." The emphasis was slight, but it was there. Rachel said nothing more, though a ripple of unease tightened her chest. She had watched Linda long enough to know when the older woman had picked someone to look down upon. It was subtle at first, a clipped tone here, a heavy hand with a tray there. but it always built into something worse. Naomi remained unaware, or perhaps simply chose not to acknowledge it. She turned the page of her sketchbook, the scratch of her pen a gentle sound beneath the murmur of boarding announcements. Her lines curved into the shape of an arch, a wing, the beginnings of some architectural vision. She breathed easily, shoulders relaxed, a calm picture against the stress-filled backdrop of the airport. That calmness infuriated Linda more than anything else, because Naomi looked like she belonged, and, in Linda's mind, she didn't. Linda had seen thousands of passengers take that seat, men in tailored suits, women with diamond bracelets, tech investors whose names she Googled during service breaks, people she decided had earned the right to first class. But Naomi in Linda's eyes, she was different. She was the kind of passenger Linda assumed had gotten here through points, or some corporate diversity initiative, or a lucky upgrade at the gate. Surely not because she could afford it. Surely not because she deserved it. That assumption sat in Linda's stomach like a stone, heavy, irritating, growing sharper with each glance at 1A. The boarding process ended. The door closed with a mechanical thud. Liberty Air Flight 417 began to taxi away from Chicago's runway lights, its nose turning toward the night sky of Los Angeles. The aircraft vibrated softly, a familiar rhythm. Rachel secured the galley. Linda began her patrol. Her steps were precise, her gaze assessing. She smiled broadly at the silver-haired man in 2B, a venture capitalist she'd recognized from a magazine. "Mr. Lane, it's such a pleasure having you on board tonight. Champagne." "Yes, please," he said with a practiced smile, and she poured with extra flourish. For the couple in row 3, she leaned closer, whispering about wine pairings. She offered them warmed nuts in a larger portion, her voice tinged with warmth, her laugh quick and easy. But when she reached Naomi, the air shifted. Naomi looked up only briefly, her eyes gentle but steady. "Sparkling water, with lime, please, when you have a moment." Her tone was soft, unhurried, polite, but Linda heard something else entirely. "When you have a moment." The phrase rang in her head as arrogance, as entitlement, as if Naomi were reminding her that she could wait because she expected to be served. Linda's jaw tightened. She poured the water, not sparkling but still, and set it down with a little more force than necessary. A small splash wet the napkin. Naomi calmly reached for it, dabbing the spill without complaint. No reaction, no anger, no indignation, just composure. And that lack of reaction cut deeper than if Naomi had snapped at her. Linda wanted confrontation. She wanted a reason to prove her judgment correct that Naomi was difficult, that she was loud, that she didn't belong. But instead she was met with grace, and that grace made Linda feel powerless. Her kingdom felt smaller, her grip on control weaker. As the plane ascended through the low clouds, the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers reclined. The glow of screens flickered across the cabin. Naomi flipped another page of her sketchbook, her face lit by the small reading lamp above. Linda watched. Her envy was silent, but it was gathering force like a storm on the horizon. And Naomi, unaware of the venom simmering beside her, simply sketched the arc of a wing, the kind of wing that promised flight and freedom. But freedom was the one thing Linda had never allowed anyone else inside her skybound kingdom. The stage was set at 35,000 feet. 2 women sat only a few feet apart, but an entire world stood between them, and neither of them knew how violently that world was about to collide. Naomi Carter had never been one to flaunt her success. Even now, seated in first class on Liberty Air Flight 417, she looked less like a woman eager to be noticed and more like someone entirely at peace with herself. She had worked too hard, fought too many invisible battles, to waste energy on proving her worth to strangers. The cream-colored pantsuit she wore was tailored but understated. A silver bracelet rested loosely around her wrist, the only jewelry she had chosen for this trip. Her leather-bound sketchbook, with its worn corners and faint indentations from years of use, was her constant companion. Inside were hundreds of lines and curves, fragments of ideas that might one day become airports, libraries, or bridges. Naomi was an architect, not just by profession but by temperament. She had always believed that structure could be more than concrete and steel. It could be a form of poetry, a kind of grace captured in form. That grace extended to the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she occupied space. Even here, at 35,000 feet, she radiated calm. And yet, beneath that calm, there was always a quiet vigilance, because Naomi knew, perhaps more than most, that her presence in places like this was often judged before she even opened her mouth. As she sat back, pen moving across paper, her mind wandered. She remembered her first business trip years ago, when she had been the only black woman in a conference room full of men in gray suits. She remembered the polite but skeptical looks, the questions that were less about her ideas and more about whether she deserved a seat at the table at all. She had learned then that composure could be its own form of defiance, that silence, when wielded carefully, was sometimes louder than a raised voice. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who used to tell her, "Baby, you can't control what people see when they look at you, but you can control how you carry yourself when they do." Those words had become her armor, and tonight, on this flight, that armor was already being tested. From the moment she boarded, Naomi had felt the weight of the senior attendant's eyes. Linda Graves had not been subtle, the way she had smiled too widely at the businessman in 2B, the way her voice had softened when she spoke to the couple in row 3, and then the clipped tone, the pointed emphasis when she turned to Naomi. It was a performance Naomi had seen before. The quiet hostility that dressed itself in professionalism. Naomi had chosen, as always, not to respond in kind. Her request for sparkling water with lime had been simple, ordinary. But Linda's reaction had carried that faint note of disbelief, as though even Naomi's choice of drink were an inconvenience. When the glass had been set down with unnecessary force, Naomi had only dabbed at the spill and returned to her sketchbook. Her refusal to react wasn't passivity, it was strategy, because she had learned that when you meet hostility with calm, you rob it of its power. Still, beneath the surface, her chest tightened. She had spent her life navigating these moments, the ones that reminded her she was seen as out of place. She could not name how many times she had walked into a room and felt eyes dart across her skin, assessing, doubting, deciding. Each time she had stood taller, spoken clearer, carried herself with poise, but each time a small piece of her had grown weary. She turned the page in her sketchbook, letting the pen sweep into the outline of a terminal roofline, an arc designed to catch light in a way that welcomed travelers instead of intimidating them. Her work was always about movement, about space and belonging. Perhaps, she thought, it was because she had spent so much of her life fighting to belong herself. Rachel Kim, the junior attendant, noticed Naomi's stillness from the galley. There was something almost magnetic about her presence, Rachel thought. Even drenched in subtle disrespect, she radiated dignity. Rachel wanted to say something, to intervene, but the weight of hierarchy pressed on her. Linda was her senior, her mentor in some ways, and Rachel had learned quickly that speaking out against her meant consequences. So she stayed quiet, hands tightening around the edge of a tray, guilt blooming in her stomach. Naomi, unaware of Rachel's inner conflict, pressed her pen to the page harder than she meant to. The line went darker, thicker, cutting across the delicate sketch. She paused, exhaled, and leaned back in her seat. Her mind whispered questions she had asked herself for years. Should she confront Linda? Should she demand the same warmth given to the other passengers? Or was silence the better weapon here, the shield that kept her dignity intact? The answer never came easily, because each choice carried its own weight. Speaking up meant risking the label angry, difficult, ungrateful. Staying silent meant carrying the sting alone, unseen by anyone but herself. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines steady her breathing. The cabin smelled faintly of citrus from the pre-flight wipes, mingled with the metallic scent of recycled air. She imagined her husband's voice, calm and steady, reminding her that she didn't have to carry every battle alone. Ethan always said the same thing. Your silence is powerful, Naomi, but so is your truth. You get to choose which one speaks louder. She smiled faintly at the memory. Ethan Cole was not just the CEO of Liberty Air, he was her anchor. But she'd never leaned on his title, never used his power as a shield. She wanted to stand on her own merit, to be seen for who she was, not just who she was married to. That was why she never introduced herself as his wife when she traveled. That was why she always kept her sketchbook open to remind herself that her identity was her own. And yet, as the minutes passed, she could feel Linda's eyes again, passing by, watching, waiting. Naomi shifted in her seat, her pen poised above the page, her body language calm, but inside, a small storm brewed. She knew what this was. She had seen it too many times. A stranger deciding her worth without knowing her story. A stranger reducing her existence to a judgment, a bias. A sneer whispered under the breath. Her pulse quickened. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled. She reminded herself of the truth. She belonged here. She had earned this seat. Her work had built terminals that moved millions of passengers every year. Her designs had won awards, contracts, respect. Her life had been carved out of discipline, talent, and resilience. No glare from a bitter flight attendant could rewrite that. But even as she steadied herself, the thought crept in. How many more times would she have to prove it? How many more years of quiet grace before the world stopped asking her to? The engines roared slightly louder as the aircraft climbed. Lights dimmed, passengers settled into their movies. The silver-haired man in 2B unfolded a newspaper. The couple in row 3 ordered wine, and Naomi Carter, seated in 1A, returned to her sketchbook. Her pen moved slowly now, lines deliberate, purposeful. She drew a wide arch, an entrance to an airport terminal, and beneath it, a smaller arch, a doorway. She shaded the lines so that the doorway glowed brighter than the rest. An invitation, a welcome. She stared at the sketch for a long moment, then closed her eyes again. Poise. Always poise. But in her heart, a quiet voice whispered what she refused to admit out loud. That one day, her composure might not be enough, and that, perhaps, tonight, at 35,000 feet, her silence would be tested more brutally than ever before. Linda Graves had spent more than 2 decades in the air, and yet tonight, as Liberty Air Flight 417 leveled off into its cruising altitude, she felt the same gnawing dissatisfaction that had haunted her for years. To the passengers, she was a senior flight attendant, crisp uniform, polished smile, and endless authority over the cabin. To herself, she was someone who had once believed this job would be glamorous, meaningful, even enviable. When she first put on the Liberty Air wings as a young woman, she thought she would travel the world, live a life of adventure, and be admired for her professionalism. In the beginning, that dream carried her through the long hours and the time zones. She had marveled at foreign skylines through hotel windows, taken photos of herself in Paris and Rome, and posted them with captions that made her family back in Ohio jealous. She had felt important, like a citizen of the world. But 22 years was a long time. The novelty had worn off. The endless red-eye flights, the layovers in budget hotels instead of glamorous cities, the difficult passengers, and the younger attendants who seemed to rise faster than she had at all ate at her pride. The uniform that once made her feel powerful now felt like a costume she was trapped inside. And now there was Naomi Carter in Seat 1A, a reminder of everything Linda felt she had been denied. Linda poured coffee for the man in 2B, Arthur Lane, and smiled just a little wider than usual. She had already Googled him during the crew briefing earlier. A well-known attorney, wealthy, respectable, the kind of man Linda considered worthy of her attention. She leaned in slightly, offered him an extra packet of sugar, and laughed politely when he made a bland joke about the coffee being stronger than courtroom espresso. That was the kind of passenger Linda wanted to serve someone who reinforced her sense of importance. Someone whose approval made her feel relevant. But when she turned back toward Naomi, the warmth evaporated. Naomi was sketching again, pen moving smoothly across her paper, her focus entirely inward. She hadn't laughed at Linda's forced jokes, hadn't smiled at her exaggerated service. She hadn't even looked impressed when Linda rattled off the vintage of the champagne. She was just there, silent, calm, existing as though she needed nothing from Linda at all. That indifference burned worse than open hostility. Linda's resentment was layered, like sediment at the bottom of a glass. There was the professional envy, the sense that younger attendants like Rachel Kim were already more popular with passengers and better liked by supervisors. There was the personal frustration, the years of holidays spent alone, the relationships that had crumbled under the strain of constant travel, and then there was the prejudice, the unspoken bias that Linda had never admitted to herself out loud but carried like a reflex. She looked at Naomi's skin, at her braids, at her elegance, and some bitter part of her decided she did not belong. Linda told herself it wasn't about race, not really. It was about attitude. It was about how Naomi carried herself with that quiet confidence, as though she didn't have to try. Linda hated that. She told herself Naomi was probably flying on points, probably some corporate handout, probably not really successful in her own right. That was the story she crafted in her mind, and once she believed it, she treated it as fact. But deep down, she knew the truth. Naomi Carter belonged here more than Linda did, and that truth was unbearable. Linda adjusted her bun in the reflection of the galley mirror, tugged at the hem of her jacket, and let her mind drift back to all the promotions she had missed. She should have been in management by now, supervising crews from the ground, or even in corporate training. But each time a position opened, it had gone to someone else, someone younger, someone the airline could put in front of cameras and say, "Look at our modern image." She had watched those promotions pass her by, and with each one, the resentment grew. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Passengers settled into their screens. The hush of the cruising altitude was her favorite time. Normally, she relished this period of quiet authority. She would walk the aisles, check seat belts, rearrange blankets, reminding herself she was still in control. But tonight, each time her eyes returned to 1A, that control slipped further away. She imagined what Naomi's life must be like. A fancy job title, a home in some coastal city, invitations to dinners and galas, people who looked at her with respect, not suspicion. Linda's stomach turned with envy, because all of it felt like it had been stolen from her. She was the one who had given her life to this job. She was the one who had sacrificed nights, weekends, and family gatherings. And yet, here she was, serving drinks to people like Naomi, who seemed to glide into privilege without effort. It was not fair. It had never been fair. She passed Rachel in the galley. The younger attendant's eyes lingered on her a little too long, and Linda bristled. She could sense judgment there, even if Rachel said nothing. Linda snapped, eyes forward. "Rachel, watch your service." Rachel nodded quickly, murmuring, "Yes." Linda, and busied herself with reorganizing cups, but her unease lingered in the air, and Linda felt it like a thorn pressing deeper. Her thoughts grew darker. What would it take to remind Naomi that she didn't belong, not a scene? No. Linda was too seasoned for that. But something subtle, something sharp enough to sting, but small enough to look like an accident. She had years of practice in that art, tiny acts of cruelty hidden beneath a veneer of professionalism. Her fingers tapped against the counter, a glass, a napkin, a tray. She imagined the possibilities. Her inner voice whispered that she was going too far, that maybe Naomi hadn't done anything wrong, that maybe she was only being polite. But the other voice, the louder, bitter one, drowned it out. That voice told her she deserved to put Naomi in her place. That voice told her Naomi's composure was arrogance. That voice told her she still had power, even if her career had stalled. Linda clung to that voice because without it, she had nothing. She watched Naomi pick up her water, take a sip, then return to her sketching without a word. And Linda decided, not tonight, not yet, but soon, she would act. She would remind Naomi Carter that this was her cabin, her domain, her kingdom in the sky. And if Naomi insisted on sitting in 1A as though she owned it, then Linda would find a way to prove otherwise. Her resentment crystallized into intent. The storm inside her chest was no longer just envy. It was a plan waiting to unfold. At 35,000 feet, resentment had found its stage, and Linda Graves was ready to play her part. The cabin had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Seatbelt lights dimmed, trays clicked into place, and the faint glow of individual screens gave the cabin a quiet, starry atmosphere. Liberty Air Flight 417 was somewhere over the Midwest now, carving through the night sky at 35,000 feet. For most passengers, this was the calmest part of any journey. For Naomi Carter, it was the part where subtle hostility began to sharpen into something she could no longer ignore. Linda Graves moved through the aisle with the precision of a metronome. Each step was measured, each gesture polished, as if she were performing a role she had perfected over decades. To the untrained eye, she was simply doing her job. But Naomi had lived too long in spaces where judgment hid behind politeness. She could see the performance for what it was. Linda stopped at row 3, leaning in close to the couple with the wine glasses. Her voice was warm, almost maternal, as she asked whether they would prefer the Merlot or the Pinot Noir. She laughed softly at their response, scribbled the order on her pad, and promised to return with extra crackers on the side. Then she turned. The warmth vanished. She reached Naomi's row, and her eyes flicked to the sketchbook on the tray table. Her lips pursed, her voice clipped. "Tray up. Please, service cart coming through." Naomi looked down at her sketchbook, then back up at Linda. The service cart was still 2 rows away. She had plenty of time, but she said nothing. She simply closed the sketchbook, lifted the tray, and tucked it into place. "Thank you," Linda said, the word carrying a frost that the passengers behind her could not detect. Naomi nodded, her face composed. Inside, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. It was not the action itself, after all. Flight attendants asked passengers to stow trays all the time. It was the way it was delivered. Politeness without warmth, instruction without patience, the subtle message, you don't quite belong here. Rachel Kim followed behind the service cart, her hands busy arranging drink orders, but her eyes caught the exchange. She had been watching, quietly cataloging each small act. The splash of water on the napkin earlier, the clipped tone now. She knew what it meant, and she hated herself for staying silent. When the cart reached Naomi's row, Linda performed the same ritual she had with every other passenger, but the difference was in the details. She offered Arthur Lane and 2B a wide smile and recited the drink list with care. To Naomi, she rattled it off quickly, without looking at her. Naomi's voice was calm. "Sparkling water again. Please, with lime. If you have it." Linda did not write it down. "We'll see what we can do," she replied. It was the smallest of phrases, one Naomi had heard 1,000 times before. "We'll see what we can do." The kind of phrase that placed doubt where there should have been certainty. A phrase that suggested she was asking for too much, even when all she wanted was a simple glass of water. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she let it go. She had learned long ago that answering hostility with anger only gave it fuel. Linda turned to Rachel. "Hand me a still water." Rachel froze for a split second. Naomi had asked for sparkling, not still. Rachel opened her mouth to correct her, but Linda's eyes cut sharply toward her, a warning in a single glance. Rachel closed her lips, reached for the still water, and handed it over. The glass landed on Naomi's tray table without a lime, without apology. Naomi looked at it for a moment, then lifted it carefully. She took a sip, calm, composed, every gesture deliberate. But inside, a quiet storm was beginning. She thought of her mother's words again. "Carry yourself with dignity. Never let them see you break." But she also thought of the countless times she had swallowed moments like this, in boardrooms, in restaurants, in airports, each moment small on its own. But together they built a weight that was exhausting to carry. Was silence really enough anymore? Arthur Lane and 2B had been watching, too. He wasn't a man easily distracted, but years of cross-examining witnesses had trained him to see the small things others overlooked. The way Naomi's request had been brushed aside. The way Linda's tone shifted depending on who sat in the seat. He made a mental note of it, his lawyer's mind already labeling it as evidence. Rachel brought crackers to the couple in row 3. Her hands shook slightly as she placed them down. She felt complicit, guilty, caught in a trap between obedience to her senior and her own conscience. She told herself she was new. She couldn't risk trouble this early in her career. But her heart twisted when she glanced at Naomi, who sat in 1A quietly, drinking still water she had not ordered. Linda returned to the galley, satisfied. To her, it was a small victory, a reminder that she still had control in her kingdom. She justified it easily in her head. Passengers always asked for things we don't have: sparkling water, special meals, blankets in a different color. She told herself Naomi was no different, just another demanding traveler who needed to be reminded of the rules. But the truth was, Naomi had not demanded anything. She had been polite, calm, gracious, and that grace was what infuriated Linda the most, because it left no excuse for her behavior, no justification she could hide behind. It revealed the hostility for exactly what it was. Naomi set her glass down and opened her sketchbook again. Her pen hovered above the page, then began to move. The lines she drew now were different, sharper, angled, less like wings, more like walls. She realized her own mood was shaping the architecture she imagined. Instead of open arches and light-filled terminals, she was sketching barricades, divisions, structures designed to separate. Her chest tightened again, and she closed her eyes. She tried to breathe through it, tried to remind herself that she was stronger than this moment. But the question pressed harder. Why must she always be the one to endure with silence? Why must she always carry herself with poise when others carried nothing but cruelty? Her inner voice battled itself. Speak. No. Stay quiet. Confront her. No. Don't give her the satisfaction. It was an exhausting war that raged silently in her heart. Rachel noticed Naomi's closed eyes, the stillness in her posture. She wanted to lean over to whisper that she had seen it too, that she believed her, that she was sorry. But she said nothing. Fear held her tongue. Arthur Lane folded his newspaper. He cleared his throat softly, as though testing whether to speak. But he, too, remained silent, choosing instead to watch and wait. The cabin continued to hum with the quiet of the night. Movies flickered on screens, wine glasses clinked softly, and in seat 1A, Naomi Carter sat with her sketchbook closed again, her dignity intact but her patience fraying. Subtle hostility was often more painful than open attack, because it left no clear wound, no visible mark. It was invisible to those who didn't look closely. But to Naomi, it was unmistakable. She had endured it before. She could endure it again. But this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to. And in the shadows of the galley, Linda Graves smiled to herself, convinced that she had reminded Naomi who truly ruled the cabin. What Linda did not know was that the eyes of others were watching, and that her quiet acts of hostility were planting seeds that would soon grow into consequences she could never imagine. At 35,000 feet, the battle lines were being drawn, and Naomi Carter, though still silent, was no longer willing to surrender. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic. Most passengers had settled into their own small worlds. A few watched movies, the glow of their screens reflecting off tired faces. Some drifted into sleep, their heads resting against window shades or tucked into travel pillows. But in first class, the quiet was heavy, almost electric. Something was shifting, and Naomi Carter could feel it in the air. She had returned to her sketchbook, though her lines had grown impatient, restless. She wasn't sketching for beauty anymore. She was sketching for release. Sharp angles cut across the page, darker strokes that pressed the pen so hard it nearly tore the paper. She paused, staring at what she had drawn, a jagged structure, rigid and unwelcoming. It was nothing like the graceful designs she normally created. It was a mirror of her mood. Rachel Kim noticed from the galley. She was supposed to be arranging cups for the next round of service, but her eyes kept drifting to Naomi. There was something in Naomi's posture, the set of her shoulders, that spoke of endurance stretched thin. Rachel felt her own stomach twist with unease. She told herself she should step in, even if only quietly. But fear still anchored her in place. Linda Graves, however, had no such hesitation. She walked past Naomi's seat again, this time slowing just enough to let her words carry weight. "Ma'am, please keep your belongings inside the seat pocket," she said, glancing at the sketchbook Naomi held loosely in her hands. Naomi looked up, startled. The sketchbook wasn't blocking anything, wasn't violating any safety rule. She blinked, measuring her response carefully. "It's just my notebook," she said softly. Linda's eyes narrowed, her tone firm. "Belongings go in the pocket, not on your lap. Regulations." It wasn't true, not in the way Linda implied. Passengers were free to hold books, tablets, even food trays when the seatbelt light wasn't on. Naomi knew it. Linda knew it. And yet here they were. Naomi closed the notebook slowly, slid it into the pocket, and sat back. Her face betrayed nothing, but her chest tightened as if a string had been pulled taut inside her. Arthur Lane in 2B lowered his newspaper, his gaze sharp. He'd been a trial lawyer for 3 decades, and he recognized what he was seeing now, intimidation disguised as authority. His jaw clenched, and though he said nothing, he felt the urge to rise, to object as he would in a courtroom. But this wasn't a courtroom, and so he waited, silent for now, gathering evidence. Linda walked on, satisfied. She stopped at row 3 again, asking if the couple needed refills on their wine. Her laughter rang louder this time, exaggerated, like a bell chiming just to prove it could. Naomi exhaled slowly, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She could feel her pulse rising, the heat creeping up her neck. She told herself to stay calm, to keep her composure. She had endured worse. She had endured it in boardrooms, in airports, in restaurants. This was nothing new. But deep inside, another voice whispered, "Enough." She reached into the seat pocket, pulled out her sketchbook again, and placed it deliberately back on her lap. Rachel's breath caught. She saw it for what it was, not defiance and anger, but defiance and dignity. Naomi wasn't raising her voice, wasn't breaking rules. She was simply reclaiming her right to exist without apology. Linda noticed almost immediately. Her eyes flicked toward Naomi as she passed again, and for a moment their gazes locked. Naomi's expression was calm, unreadable, but her quiet determination was unmistakable. That was the spark. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scene. It was a silent refusal to bend any further. Linda's lips tightened. She walked past, but her mind burned with irritation. How dare this woman challenge her? How dare she undo her authority with nothing but silence and poise? Linda felt her control slipping, and with it, her sense of power. Arthur Lane finally spoke, his voice calm but pointed. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said to Linda as she passed his seat. "I couldn't help but notice. I've flown a lot, and I've never heard of a rule against holding a notebook." Linda froze for a fraction of a second, then forced a smile. Safety guidelines vary. It's better to be cautious. Arthur held her gaze steadily, or selective. The word hung in the air like a blade. Naomi turned her head slightly toward Arthur, her eyes soft with gratitude. She didn't speak, but the smallest nod acknowledged his support. Linda's jaw clenched. She muttered something about checking the galley and walked off, her footsteps sharper than before. Rachel's hands trembled as she stacked cups. She admired Arthur's courage, admired Naomi's quiet strength even more. And yet, she still said nothing. Fear pressed against her chest, heavier than ever. Naomi looked back down at her sketchbook. Her pen moved again, but now the lines softened. Curves returned, arches lifted, light filtered through her imagined spaces once more. The spark had steadied her, given her back a piece of control she hadn't realized she had lost. But she knew this wasn't over. She knew Linda wasn't finished. The storm had only just begun, and sparks had a way of igniting flames. The engines droned on. Passengers shifted in their seats. Flight 417 cut through the night sky, unaware that in its quiet cabin, a battle for dignity and respect was reaching a dangerous simmer. Linda stood in the galley, her reflection staring back at her from the stainless steel surface of the coffee pot. Her face looked tight, older than she wanted to admit. She pressed her lips together, seething. She'd been challenged, first by Naomi's poise, then by Arthur's words, and beneath it all, Rachel's silence nagged at her. She told herself she couldn't lose control, not here, not in front of passengers, but control was exactly what she felt slipping through her fingers. She needed to act, to reassert herself, to remind everyone who commanded this cabin. And as her thoughts turned darker, she began to plan. In seat 1A, Naomi Carter sat with her sketchbook open, her expression calm but her heart racing. She had lit the spark. She didn't know yet what it would burn, but she knew she was ready for whatever came next. She would not shrink. Not tonight, not anymore. The spark had been struck. The fire was coming. The cabin was hushed. Yet, beneath the quiet, Naomi could sense something shifting. It was as if the air itself had thickened. Every time Linda Graves walked by, the tension followed, heavy and unmistakable. The spark had been lit in that exchange over the sketchbook, and now the fire was creeping closer to the surface. Naomi leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling for a moment, letting the hum of the engines steady her breathing. She could still hear Arthur Lane's words echoing in her head, or selective, one phrase, casually spoken, yet filled with the kind of weight Naomi had carried her whole life. It was a reminder that she was not imagining things, that someone else had seen it too. That acknowledgement gave her strength, but strength, she knew, often provoked pushback. Linda returned from the galley with another tray of drinks, her smile broad and deliberate as she served the couple in row 3. She laughed again at something the man said, touched his shoulder lightly as if they were old friends. Then she turned to the front row. Her voice changed. "Miss Carter," she said, crisp and cool. "I'll need you to adjust your seat. It's reclined too far during meal service." Naomi straightened. The seat was not reclined at all. She hadn't touched the button since boarding. She tilted her head slightly, her tone calm but firm. "My seat is upright." Linda's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's not at the proper angle. Please adjust it." Arthur Lane shifted in his seat. He glanced at Naomi's chair, clearly upright, then looked at Linda. "Her seat looks just fine," he said, his lawyer's voice calm but carrying authority. Linda's eyes flicked toward him, the faintest flash of annoyance crossing her features. "Sir, with respect, I'll determine what's proper for service." Arthur's brows lifted, his tone sharp. "With respect. I think everyone can see the seat is upright." A murmur rose from the rows behind them. A passenger removed his headphones, curious. Another leaned into the aisle, sensing the tension. Naomi's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. She met Linda's gaze evenly, then spoke in a low, steady voice. "My seat has been upright since takeoff. If you'd like, you're welcome to check the lever yourself." Linda's jaw tightened. She reached for the seat, pressed the button, and nothing moved. The seat stayed exactly where it was. Upright. Silence fell over the nearby rows. Rachel Kim froze by the galley curtain, her heart hammering. She had seen it all. The seat was upright. Linda had been wrong, and now everyone knew it. For a long moment, Linda stood there, her hand still on the lever, her face burning under the eyes of passengers who were now paying attention. Then she let go abruptly, straightening her jacket. "Very well," she said coldly, "but please remember to follow instructions the first time in the future." Naomi felt heat rise in her chest, but she held her tongue. There was nothing to gain from arguing further. Linda had exposed herself without Naomi saying another word. Arthur exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He muttered just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Unbelievable." Linda turned away, but the damage had already been done. The murmur of passengers grew louder, whispers drifting through the cabin. Some shook their heads, others rolled their eyes. People knew what they had seen, and no amount of forced authority could erase it. Rachel stepped forward hesitantly, a tray of bread rolls in her hands. She stopped by Naomi's seat, her voice quiet but kind. "Would you like one?" "Ma'am, they're fresh." Naomi looked up at her, meeting her eyes. She saw something there, empathy, perhaps even regret. She smiled softly. "Thank you." "Rachel." "Yes, I'll take one." Rachel placed it gently on her napkin, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to say more, to apologize for the hostility Naomi had endured, but she couldn't. Not yet. Still, the look they exchanged was enough. Naomi knew she wasn't alone. Linda returned to the galley, her movements sharper now, the mask of professionalism cracking. She poured coffee with more force than necessary, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the cups. She could feel the stares from passengers, could sense that control was slipping away from her, and worse, she knew it was because of Naomi. Her thoughts spiraled quickly. For years she had commanded respect in the cabin. She had been the authority, the one no one questioned. But now, in a single night, a single passenger had undermined her. And it wasn't just the passenger, it was the lawyer in 2B, the whispers from rows behind, the silence of Rachel, who should have supported her without hesitation. Linda clenched her teeth. She wasn't going to lose. Not to Naomi Carter. Not tonight. Back in 1A. Naomi tore a small piece of the bread roll, chewing slowly, deliberately. Each bite was an act of control, of calm in the storm. She thought about how easy it would be to lash out, to match Linda's hostility with anger. But she knew that would only give Linda what she wanted. Instead, Naomi chose stillness. But inside, she wrestled with herself. Was this enough to sit quietly, to endure, To hope others noticed? Or was it time to speak, to demand better, to refuse to let hostility masquerade as authority? Her inner voice battled again. Stay calm. No. Speak. Hold your dignity. No. Call it out. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, heavier with every passing second. Arthur leaned slightly toward her, his voice low. If this continues, I'll be filing a formal complaint the moment we land. Naomi glanced at him, gratitude softening her features. Thank you, she whispered. Arthur gave a small nod, then sat back, his eyes never leaving Linda as she emerged from the galley once more. The clash was no longer quiet. It had begun to draw attention, and as Linda moved down the aisle again, her smile was gone. The warmth she had offered other passengers now looked forced, brittle. The cracks were showing, and everyone could see them. Naomi closed her sketchbook and placed it carefully on her lap once more. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and prepared herself. The spark had already been struck. Now the fire was catching, and at 35,000 feet, there was no place to run from the flames. The hum of the aircraft had always been Naomi's lullaby, a steady rhythm that calmed her on countless flights. But tonight it was different. The engines still roared softly outside, but inside the cabin the air felt charged, restless. Every eye in the first few rows seemed to carry a question. Every movement from Linda Graves felt like a challenge. The spark had already ignited. Now the flame was licking closer to something combustible. Naomi kept her sketchbook closed on her lap. She didn't touch it, though her fingers itched to draw. Instead, she sat still, poised, her face calm. But her silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate. It was defiance wrapped in dignity. She could feel it in the way her spine straightened, in the quiet power of her stillness. Linda emerged again from the galley, her steps sharper than before, her tray balanced with forced precision. She stopped first at Arthur Lane's seat. "Coffee, sir?" she asked with a smile so tight it looked painful. Arthur shook his head. "No, thank you." His tone was polite but firm, the kind of tone that carried unspoken meaning. He didn't trust her. Linda turned toward Naomi, her eyes cold. "Ms. Carter, can I offer you coffee?" Naomi shook her head gently. "No, thank you. Perhaps tea, then something to help you relax." Linda's voice lingered on the last word, a suggestion wrapped in insult. Naomi inhaled slowly. She met Linda's gaze directly, her voice soft but steady. "I'm quite relaxed already." The reply was simple, but the air around them shifted. Passengers stirred, sensing the undercurrent. Linda's smile vanished. Her tone hardened. "Then, please sit properly. Your posture is obstructing service." Rachel Kim froze in the aisle. She had been trailing behind, holding a basket of snacks. Naomi was sitting perfectly straight, her tray table clear, nothing in the way. Rachel's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to correct the lie, but fear held her silent again. Arthur's voice broke the tension. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Her posture isn't obstructing anything." Linda's head whipped toward him, her authority openly challenged. "Sir, this is between me and the passenger." Arthur didn't flinch. "No, it isn't. When you mistreat someone in front of witnesses, it becomes everyone's business." The murmur of passengers grew louder. A man in row 4 leaned into the aisle, watching openly now. A woman across from him shook her head in disbelief. The quiet hostility Linda had been cultivating in shadows was suddenly exposed under a spotlight. Naomi's chest tightened. She wanted to stay composed, but the weight of it all pressed hard. Years of moments like this. Small humiliations piled one on top of the other, and now here it was again at 35,000 feet. Her inner voice screamed in conflict. Stay calm. No. Speak. Protect your dignity. No. Fight back. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clenched them in her lap until the shaking stopped. She lifted her chin, her voice even but carrying steel. I have followed every instruction you've given me. Ms. Graves, I have been polite. I have been patient. What more do you want? The words cut through the cabin. Linda's lips parted, but for once she had no immediate reply. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Naomi's question was not just for her, it was for every person who had ever endured hostility dressed as professionalism, prejudice wrapped in politeness. The passengers felt it. The weight of truth settled over them. Rachel's breath caught. She couldn't stay quiet anymore. Her voice trembled, but she forced it out. She's right, Rachel said softly. Ms. Carter has done nothing wrong. All eyes turned to her. The junior flight attendant looked terrified, but her words hung in the air like a lifeline. Linda's face flushed crimson. Betrayal burned in her chest. She glared at Rachel, then at Naomi, her composure shattering. Enough. I will not be disrespected in my cabin. Arthur rose halfway from his seat, his voice booming with authority. This is not your cabin. This is Liberty Air's cabin, and your behavior is out of line. The clash was no longer subtle. It was open, raw, undeniable. Linda's hands shook as she clutched the tray. Her thoughts spiraled. She could feel the judgment of passengers, the loss of control, the humiliation of being challenged. Something inside her snapped. Without thinking, she tilted the tray, letting a stream of cold water spill directly across Naomi's lap. Gasps filled the cabin. Naomi froze, the water seeping into her clothes, cold against her skin. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then whispers exploded around them. Arthur surged to his feet. That's assault, he said sharply, pointing at Linda. Everyone here saw it. Rachel dropped the snack basket, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. Oh my God, she whispered. Naomi sat perfectly still, her heart pounding so hard it shook her body from the inside. She lifted her eyes to Linda, calm but blazing with quiet fury. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She simply said one sentence. You've gone too far. Her voice was steady, unbroken, and it carried more power than any scream could have. Passengers began speaking over one another. Some demanded answers. Others cursed under their breath. A man from row 4 stood up, shaking his head. Unbelievable, he muttered. Absolutely unacceptable. Linda tried to collect herself, tried to paste on a mask of control, but her hands betrayed her, trembling so hard the tray rattled. She muttered something about turbulence, about accidents, but no one believed her. Not this time. Arthur pulled a napkin from his seat and handed it to Naomi. His voice was firm. You don't have to endure this anymore. Enough is enough. Naomi took the napkin, dabbing gently at her lap. Her movements were calm, measured, but inside her heart was racing. She knew this moment was bigger than her, bigger than a ruined dress or a spilled drink. It was about truth. It was about being seen. Rachel finally stepped forward, her voice stronger now. It wasn't an accident. I saw her do it. Gasps filled the air again. The breaking point had arrived. There was no returning to subtle hostility, no pretending it was imagination. Linda's actions had dragged the truth into the light for everyone to see, and Naomi Carter, soaked but unbroken, sat taller in her seat than she ever had before. The battle was no longer silent. The war for dignity had begun. The cabin of Flight 417 was no longer calm. The low buzz of conversation had grown into a storm of whispers, disbelief, and outrage. Naomi sat in 1A, her clothes damp, her body chilled by the water, but her spirit unshaken. She dabbed at her lap with Arthur Lane's napkin, each movement deliberate, composed, refusing to give Linda Graves the satisfaction of a scene. Linda stood frozen with the tray in her hands, her face flushed, her chest heaving, every eye fixed on her. She mumbled something about turbulence, her words brittle, hollow. No one bought it. Rachel Kim's voice still echoed in the air. I saw her do it. That sentence had torn the veil away. There was no going back. Arthur Lane was still standing, his eyes sharp as steel. "You need to step back, ma'am," he said firmly to Linda. "You've humiliated this passenger long enough." Linda bristled, her voice sharp. "Sir, I am in charge of this cabin. I will not be lectured by passengers." Arthur leaned slightly forward, his tone calm but with the edge of a courtroom cross-examination. "In charge does not mean above the law. What you just did was intentional assault. Every witness here knows it." Gasps followed his words. Passengers turned to one another, nodding, murmuring. A woman in row 4 spoke up, her voice clear. "I saw it too." She poured it on her. That wasn't an accident. Another man across the aisle added, "This is outrageous. She should be removed from duty right now." Linda's mask cracked further. Her smile vanished completely. She looked cornered, like a predator who had just realized the entire forest was watching. Her hand tightened on the tray until her knuckles turned white. Naomi stayed seated, breathing evenly. Inside, her heart thundered, but she would not let it show. She had carried herself through boardrooms where silence greeted her contributions, through restaurants where her presence earned stares. She knew this terrain all too well, and tonight she would not bend. Linda snapped, "Enough. I will not be judged by passengers who don't understand procedure." It was at that moment a deep, steady voice carried from the back of first class. "Then, perhaps, you'll be judged by someone who does." The cabin hushed instantly. Heads turned. From the rear of first class, a man stood, tall and composed. His presence was commanding, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. Ethan Cole walked forward, his eyes locked on Linda. Naomi's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to be here, not on this flight, not tonight. But there he was, her husband, his expression calm yet fierce. Linda blinked, recognition flickering across her face, though disbelief quickly followed. She stammered, "Mr. Cole, I didn't realize." Ethan's voice cut through her words. "That's clear." He turned his gaze briefly to Naomi, his eyes softening for just a second, then back to Linda, sharp as glass. "I watched everything. I saw every word, every lie, every attempt to humiliate her." Passengers gasped, whispers rippled again. The name Ethan Cole carried weight. Some passengers recognized him instantly, the CEO of Liberty Air, the very airline they were flying. Linda's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but resonant. "You poured water on a passenger. You singled her out without cause. You disgraced the uniform you wear." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "And you did all of it to my wife." The cabin erupted. Shocked exclamations, murmurs of disbelief, a collective inhale of realization. Naomi sat still, her heart pounding. She had never asked for rescue, had never needed it. But seeing Ethan there, standing not just as her husband but as the leader of the airline, stirred something deep inside her. Linda staggered back a step. I didn't know." Ethan's voice sharpened. "You didn't need to know who she was. You needed only to treat her with dignity. Something you clearly couldn't do." Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling but stronger now. "It's true, Mr. Cole. She targeted Naomi the entire flight. She's been unfair, hostile, and tonight..." She crossed the line. Arthur Lane nodded firmly. "I'll be providing a statement as well. What we witnessed was unacceptable." Linda's eyes darted wildly, searching for support, but there was none. Every face around her reflected disapproval, even disgust. The passengers she thought would remain silent were united against her now. Ethan took a deep breath, then spoke with finality. "Linda Graves, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words struck like thunder. Linda's mouth fell open. You can't do this mid-flight. You don't have the authority here." Ethan's voice remained calm, steady. "I am the authority here. I am the CEO of Liberty Air, and you no longer represent this airline." Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, tears filling her eyes. Relief washed over her. Arthur Lane exhaled sharply, satisfied. The passengers broke into murmurs again, but this time they were approving, grateful. Naomi looked up at Ethan, her eyes glistening. She whispered softly, so only he could hear. "You didn't have to." Ethan crouched slightly beside her seat, his voice low and tender. "I know, but I couldn't stay silent any longer." Linda backed toward the galley, her body trembling. The power she once held had evaporated, slipping from her grasp like sand through open fingers. She tried to speak, tried to justify herself, but the words caught in her throat. She turned, vanishing behind the curtain, her figure swallowed by the narrow aisle. The cabin remained charged, heavy with everything that had just unfolded. But for Naomi, something inside her eased, not because Ethan had spoken, but because the truth was no longer hers alone to carry. Others had seen it, had acknowledged it, had named it for what it was. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, the cool dampness of her clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She felt the strength in her chest return, steadier now, bolstered not by rescue but by recognition. Arthur Lane sat back down, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've tried enough cases to know when justice is served. Tonight, it was." Rachel lingered beside Naomi's seat, her voice soft. "I'm so sorry for not speaking sooner. I was scared, but you were incredible, stronger than I could ever be." Naomi opened her eyes, smiling faintly. "Strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about not letting fear decide who you are." Rachel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of admiration. Ethan stood once more, addressing the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for what you've just witnessed. This is not who we are as an airline, and it will not happen again." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling into something stronger, not for the airline, but for the stand taken, for the dignity defended. Naomi sat quietly in the center of it all, her heart steady at last, The reveal had come, and with it, a truth no one could ignore. The roar of the engines carried on outside the fuselage, steady and indifferent. But inside the cabin of Flight 417, the air was still thick with what had just happened. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, some still wide-eyed at the sight of Linda Graves being stripped of authority right there in front of them. Naomi Carter sat back, her posture as calm as ever, but her skin still clammy from the water that had soaked into her dress. Her hands rested gently on the closed sketchbook in her lap, but she didn't open it. She wasn't ready. The pencil line she normally used as refuge now felt too fragile, too intimate, to carry the weight of this moment. Across the aisle, Arthur Lane leaned back into his seat, one leg crossed over the other, his arms folded. He wore the expression of a man who had argued and won, yet there was no gloating in him. His gaze flicked occasionally toward Naomi, quiet respect etched into his features. He had fought for strangers before, in courtrooms and negotiations, but rarely had he seen someone fight with the kind of stillness Naomi possessed. Rachel Kim busied herself in the galley, though her movements betrayed her nervousness. She shuffled cups, reorganized trays, checked and rechecked supplies that didn't need checking. She was shaken by what had unfolded, and even more by her role in it. For too long she had stayed silent, watching injustice unfold under the guise of hierarchy. When she had finally spoken, it had felt like ripping a chain from her chest, but the guilt of waiting so long still weighed on her. In the rear of first class, Ethan Cole remained standing. The applause had faded, but the respect hung in the air like a steady presence. He looked at the passengers, meeting their eyes one by one, offering them reassurance without words. Then he turned toward Naomi. For a fleeting moment, his features softened, his eyes catching hers with unspoken affection. Naomi's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her heart remained heavy. He had defended her. He had revealed himself, not just as her husband, but as a CEO who would not tolerate injustice. Yet, deep inside, Naomi felt a complicated storm. Gratitude and pride, yes, but also weariness. She had wanted to fight her own battles, to prove that she did not need anyone to rescue her. And yet, wasn't it also true that every movement for justice required witnesses, allies, those who stepped forward to say, "I see what is happening, and it is wrong." She exhaled slowly, tilting her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The murmurs of passengers washed over her. Words like shameful and disgusting floated through the air, directed at Linda Graves. Naomi let them pass through her, not clinging, not rejecting, just letting them exist. But Linda herself had not disappeared. Behind the galley curtain, Linda paced in the narrow space, her breath shallow and ragged. Her hands shook as she pulled off her service jacket, tossing it onto a counter. Stripped of authority, stripped of respect, stripped of the illusion she had clung to for years, she felt herself unraveling. She had always believed she commanded the cabin, that her word carried weight beyond question. Now her word was nothing, her uniform a costume, her presence unwelcome, her thoughts spiraled. She told herself it wasn't her fault, that passengers were dramatic, that Naomi had provoked her. But deep down, in the place she never admitted aloud, she knew what she had done. She knew the hostility hadn't been about safety or service. It had been about something darker, something she had carried in her heart for years and never questioned. and now it had destroyed her. Her stomach churned. She wanted to step back into the cabin, to demand her role again, to claw back the respect she had lost. But each time she thought of the faces staring back at her, condemning, disappointed, angry, she faltered. Rachel peeked into the galley, her eyes meeting Linda's. For a brief second, Linda saw the fear and pity in the younger attendant's gaze. It made her chest tighten. Rachel quickly withdrew, leaving Linda alone again with her thoughts, back in her seat. Naomi adjusted the napkin across her lap, no longer to dry but to cover the stain spreading across the fabric of her dress. It was a small thing, a simple act of control, but it helped. She lifted her chin, her voice quiet but steady as she spoke to Arthur. "Thank you for speaking up," she said. Arthur inclined his head. "Thank you for standing your ground. You didn't need my voice. You had your own." Naomi's smile was faint but real. Sometimes a chorus carries further than a single note. Arthur's lips quirked, acknowledging the truth in her words. Ethan stepped closer to her row, kneeling briefly beside her seat so he could speak softly, just for her. "Are you all right?" Naomi looked at him, her eyes filled with more emotion than she could put into words. "I will be," she said. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I couldn't stay silent. Not tonight." Naomi studied his face, the strength there, the fury contained but controlled. She knew his silence had always been a choice of strategy, of when and how to wield his influence. But tonight he had chosen to step forward as a husband first, and that mattered more than any corporate title. She whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, pressing her hand once more before standing again, restoring his composed authority for the passengers watching. The hours of the flight stretched on, but the atmosphere remained taut. Conversations ebbed and flowed, but the shadow of the confrontation lingered. Some passengers whispered about lawsuits, others speculated about headlines, still others simply shook their heads, replaying the moment in their minds. Naomi finally opened her sketchbook again. Her pencil moved slowly, tracing not an image of turbulence or anger, but something softer, a circle, broken at first, then closed, a symbol of completion, of wholeness, fragile but unbroken. Rachel passed by quietly, pausing for a moment. She saw the drawing, her lips parting slightly. Naomi lifted her eyes, offering her the smallest nod. Rachel swallowed hard, her guilt still evident, but that nod told her forgiveness was possible, even if it would take time. In the galley, Linda sat on a jump seat, her head in her hands. She thought of the years she had given to Liberty Air, the promotions she had earned, the respect she had demanded. And now she thought of how it had all collapsed in a single night, undone not by turbulence or error, but by her own choices. She closed her eyes tightly, but the sound of Naomi's steady voice echoed in her memory. "I have followed every instruction. What more do you want?" She had no answer. The fallout was not just hers to bear. It rippled through every passenger who had seen injustice, through Rachel who had faced her own silence, through Arthur who had chosen to stand, through Ethan who had broken his distance, and most of all through Naomi, who sat quietly but firmly, her dignity intact, her resolve stronger than ever. The flight wasn't over. The night wasn't finished. But nothing would ever return to the way it had been when they first boarded. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted forever. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 417 cut through the night sky. Outside, The stars glimmered faintly beyond the double-paned windows, but inside the mood was anything but peaceful. The confrontation had ended, but its echo still reverberated through every seat and every heart. Naomi Carter shifted in her seat, her dress still damp where Linda Graves had poured the water. The chill had settled into her skin, but the fire inside her kept her steady. She stared at her sketchbook, pencil poised but unmoving, caught between the need to create and the weight of what she carried. She wanted to let it out, to draw her feelings into form, but the storm within her resisted release. Her mind replayed the events over and over, the cold splash, the gasps of passengers, Ethan's voice cutting through the chaos. She had endured humiliation before, but never so publicly, never with such venom. And yet she had endured. The dignity she clung to had not abandoned her. Still, she wondered, why did she always have to fight? Why was survival for her a test again and again? Arthur Lane noticed her silence. From across the aisle, he studied her posture, the way she sat tall despite the weight pressing on her. He leaned slightly closer, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "You're stronger than anyone in this cabin. Ms. Carter, don't ever forget that." Naomi turned her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Strength doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Arthur's eyes softened. "No, but it means you refuse to let the hurt define you." Her chest tightened at his words. She looked back down at her sketchbook and finally let the pencil move. She began sketching waves, sharp and violent, crashing against a jagged cliff. But beneath the surface of the waves she drew a figure standing tall, calm, refusing to be swept away. Rachel Kim approached quietly, hesitant. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her uniform, her eyes downcast. She stopped at Naomi's row, swallowing hard. "Ms. Carter," she whispered, I want to say I'm sorry for staying silent, for not standing up sooner. I should have spoken before it went that far." Naomi looked up, her expression calm but searching. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes rimmed red, her guilt written in every line. Naomi reached for the napkin still folded on her lap and set it gently on the tray table. "You spoke when it mattered most. That takes courage, too." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I don't feel courageous." "None of us do," Naomi said softly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving through it anyway." Rachel nodded, her throat tight, before retreating down the aisle. At the back of the galley, Linda Graves sat hunched on the jump seat, her uniform jacket discarded, her eyes staring at nothing. The silence around her was deafening. She could still hear the passengers murmuring, the sound of her name whispered like a curse. She rubbed her hands together, trying to erase the tremor. Her mind was a battlefield. She told herself she had worked too long, given too much to be undone by one mistake. But it hadn't been one mistake. She knew that. Deep inside, she recognized the pattern, the sharp tone she reserved for certain passengers, the extra scrutiny, the clipped politeness that bordered on hostility. Tonight, she had gone further, pushed beyond professionalism, and poured water on a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. And now she was finished. Her chest heaved as she thought of her career crumbling, of Ethan Cole's voice delivering the final blow, CEO, husband, witness. She couldn't erase his words, couldn't undo the truth that the passengers had seen. In first class. Ethan himself sat quietly now, his presence a steady anchor. He had revealed himself, spoken as both CEO and husband, But in the silence afterward, he felt the weight of it all pressing down. He had always believed in letting Naomi fight her own battles. She had asked for that autonomy. But tonight, watching her dignity assaulted, he couldn't hold back. He had acted, and part of him wondered if she resented it. He glanced at her, studying the slope of her shoulders, the steady rhythm of her breathing. She looked serene, but he knew her too well. Inside, she was turning, wrestling, holding herself together. He reached for her hand again, tentative this time, as though asking permission. Naomi allowed it, her fingers sliding into his. She didn't look at him, but the contact was answer enough. He exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening. Time passed slowly. Passengers shifted, whispered, sipped their drinks. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Naomi. Others muttered angrily about Linda, but all knew they had witnessed something rare injustice exposed in real time, stripped bare for everyone to see. Naomi finally closed her sketchbook. She leaned her head against the seat, letting her eyes drift shut. Images swirled behind her eyelids, the splash of water, the sharp sting of humiliation, Ethan's steady voice, Rachel's trembling confession. Her heart was heavy, but beneath it she felt something else too. Pride, not in what had happened, but in how she had endured, in the truth that had been spoken aloud. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible, "I'm not invisible." Arthur Lane heard it. He smiled faintly, saying nothing, but inside he knew those 4 words carried more power than any courtroom victory. Back in the galley, Linda's storm raged on. She gripped the edge of the counter until her fingers hurt, tears blurring her vision. She wanted to lash out, to justify herself. But deep inside she knew the truth. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't an accident. It was her choice, her prejudice, her anger, and now it was her ruin. For the first time in years, she felt small. Not the kind of small that passengers made her feel when they dismissed her service, but the kind that came when a mirror was held up and the reflection was too ugly to bear. She pressed her forehead into her hands and sobbed quietly, unheard over the steady hum of the engines. Naomi opened her eyes again, sensing the heaviness lingering in the air. She looked at Ethan, then at Arthur, then down the aisle where Rachel disappeared into the shadows. Each of them carried their own storm tonight. Each of them had chosen how to face it. And she realized something. Strength wasn't only hers to carry. It was shared, reflected back through allies, through truth-tellers, through witnesses who refused to look away. She sat taller, her voice soft but resolute as she murmured to herself, "The storm doesn't break me. It reveals me." The cabin was quiet, but inside her, something had shifted. The storm within was no longer her enemy. It was her proving ground. The hours slipped by as Flight 417 carved its path westward. At 37,000 feet, the night outside the windows had been endless, but now, as the captain's voice cut through the cabin, the first signs of descent came. His calm announcement echoed overhead, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our descent into Los Angeles. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare the cabin for arrival." The words were routine, but tonight nothing felt routine. Passengers adjusted their seats, pulled blankets tighter, clicked belts into place, but the tension in the air remained heavy. The shadow of what had unfolded clinging to them like turbulence that refused to fade. Some passengers kept stealing glances at Naomi Carter and 1A, their expressions a mix of admiration and sorrow. She sat with her chin lifted, eyes forward, her sketchbook resting closed in her lap once more. Ethan Cole remained by her side. He hadn't returned to his seat fully, instead lingering close, ready if she needed him. His presence was solid, protective, yet careful not to smother. He knew Naomi valued her independence, her strength, and he had no desire to take it from her. Still, as her husband and as the CEO, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what awaited them once the wheels touched down. Arthur Lane sat straighter now, his legal mind already running through scenarios. He had witnessed countless injustices, but rarely had one unfolded so plainly before so many witnesses. He knew statements would be taken, reports filed, headlines written, and he also knew Naomi's name would no longer be just a passenger's name. It would carry the weight of a story much larger than herself. Rachel Kim moved quietly through the cabin, collecting glasses, checking belts, offering smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. She lingered near Naomi's row more than once, as if silently trying to assure her she was not alone. Naomi returned each glance with quiet acknowledgement. No grand words were exchanged, but in those brief connections, forgiveness was being built piece by piece. In the galley, Linda Graves still sat hunched, her uniform wrinkled, her hair falling loose from its tight bun. She hadn't emerged since being relieved of duty. The voices of passengers carried back to her in fragments, each word a dagger. She wanted to believe she could survive this, that one mistake didn't erase a career, but deep down she knew. The descent into Los Angeles wasn't just physical, it was her descent too, into the collapse of everything she had built. Naomi looked out the window, far below. The faint glow of the city stretched across the darkness, a constellation of lights shimmering into view. The sight stirred something inside her, a reminder of how small one moment could feel against the vastness of the world, yet how deeply it could cut into the human heart. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She knew that when they landed, the story wouldn't stay inside this cabin. It would spill outward. Phones would come out. Reports would be filed. Voices would spread. She had been humiliated, but she had also stood firm. She wondered if the world outside would see her dignity or just the spectacle of what had happened. Her thoughts drifted to Ethan. He had revealed himself not just as her husband but as the CEO of Liberty Air. His choice had been bold, decisive, and necessary, but it carried weight. His words would ignite consequences for the airline, for Linda, for every person watching. She turned to him, her voice low. "Do you regret stepping in?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, his eyes unwavering. "Not for a second. I'd do it again, 1,000 times." Naomi searched his face, seeing the truth in his words. She nodded slightly, though her own storm of emotions hadn't cleared. "I didn't need rescuing." "I know," he said gently, "but sometimes the world needs to hear more than silence. Sometimes it needs a voice that can't be ignored." Her lips curved faintly. "You sound like you've thought about this." "Every day," he admitted. The plane shuddered gently as it descended through a pocket of turbulence. Passengers gripped armrests, a murmur of unease rippling through the cabin, but Naomi barely flinched. Compared to the storm she had weathered tonight, this was nothing. Arthur leaned over slightly, his voice calm. "Ms. Carter, when we land, I'd like to offer my services. Pro bono. What happened here tonight deserves more than whispered outrage. It deserves accountability." Naomi tilted her head toward him, studying his serious expression. She appreciated his offer, but she also felt a deep weariness. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "That's all I ask," Arthur replied, leaning back. Rachel paused by Naomi's seat again, her hands clasped in front of her. Would you like a blanket? Ms. Carter, you're still damp." Naomi looked up at her, seeing the sincerity, the attempt to make amends. She nodded. "Thank you. Rachel." Rachel's eyes glistened at the use of her name. She hurried to fetch the blanket, draping it gently across Naomi's shoulders. For a moment, Naomi felt warmth return, not just from the fabric but from the gesture itself. The captain's voice returned, steady and professional. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Rachel's movements quickened, but her gaze lingered on Naomi, as if making sure she was comfortable before tending to the rest of the passengers. Linda heard the announcement and felt her chest tighten. The descent meant the end. The door would open, and she would face not just her supervisors but the flood of consequences waiting beyond. Her breathing quickened. She imagined cameras, statements, the humiliation multiplied tenfold. She wanted to vanish into the dark sky outside, to escape what was coming. But there was no escape. Naomi pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for strength to face what lay ahead, and for others who carried storms like hers, unseen and unacknowledged. She thought of every person who had ever felt small, who had ever been diminished, and she silently vowed to carry this moment for them too. The city lights grew brighter as the plane lowered, sprawling neighborhoods and glowing freeways coming into sharp relief. The passengers braced themselves for landing, but in their hearts, many still carried the image of what had happened mid-air. It wasn't turbulence they would remember. It was the splash of water, the dignity of a woman who would not break, the fall of a flight attendant who lost more than her composure. As the landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, Naomi opened her eyes again. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her the faintest nod. She returned it, her resolve steady. She was ready. Flight 417 was about to touch the ground, but for everyone aboard, the journey was far from over. The wheels touched the runway with a deep rumble, the cabin shaking as rubber met asphalt. Flight 417 slowed against a long stretch of Los Angeles International. The city lights blazing just beyond the windows, passengers straightened in their seats, some exhaling in relief, others bracing for what they knew awaited them once the doors opened. The landing was smooth, but the silence that followed was heavy with expectation. Naomi Carter sat upright, her blanket draped across her shoulders, her posture unbroken. She stared forward, her thoughts quiet but unrelenting. She felt the damp fabric of her dress against her skin, a reminder of what had happened. But she refused to let the memory define her arrival. She had entered this plane as a passenger, and she would leave it as more than that. Her dignity was intact, even if scarred. Ethan Cole glanced at her, pride mingling with sorrow in his eyes. He could feel the energy in the cabin, the passengers leaning toward Naomi with silent solidarity. He knew that the moment the door opened, their world would change. Phones would rise, cameras would flash, and the story would no longer belong to just those inside Flight 417. It would belong to everyone. The final announcement from the captain rang overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of Liberty Air, thank you for flying with us." The irony of the words did not go unnoticed. Liberty Air. Tonight, that name carried a bitter taste as the aircraft slowed to its final taxi. Rachel Kim walked briskly through the cabin, checking belts, her face pale but composed. She paused at Naomi's row, her eyes meeting Naomi's one last time before landing duties consumed her. Naomi gave a slight nod, her gaze soft, signaling both recognition and forgiveness. Rachel's throat tightened, but she returned the nod before moving on. In the galley, Linda Graves sat rigid, her hands clasped in her lap, her uniform jacket folded neatly but uselessly beside her. Her breathing was shallow. Every second brought her closer to the moment she feared most, facing the passengers as they disembarked, facing her superiors, facing the ruin of her career. She told herself she would find words, explanations, apologies even, but she knew none of them would be enough. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The plane came to a halt at the gate, the familiar ding signaling that the seatbelt sign had been turned off. Passengers unclicked their belts, stood, stretched, and reached for overhead bins. But no one rushed to the door. Many lingered, glancing at Naomi, waiting to see what would happen next. Arthur Lane remained seated, his briefcase on his lap, his eyes scanning the cabin. He noted every expression, every glance. He knew this was more than a flight, it was testimony, and the courtroom of public opinion was about to convene. The door opened with a metallic click, and the jet bridge hissed as it locked into place. A gate agent appeared, her professional smile faltering when she saw the tension inside. Ethan rose slowly, offering his hand to Naomi. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then took it, allowing him to steady her as she stood. Together, they moved toward the front of the cabin. Linda watched from the galley, her stomach twisting. She wanted to shrink into herself, but there was nowhere to hide. Naomi's presence filled the space, her dignity unshaken, while Linda felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. As Naomi and Ethan approached the exit, a ripple moved through the passengers. Some clapped softly, others simply bowed their heads. It wasn't a cheer, not a celebration, but an acknowledgement. They had seen her endure, and they honored it. Naomi paused at the threshold, the bright lights of the terminal spilling in. She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping across the cabin one last time. She didn't speak, but her gaze carried meaning, a silent message that each person felt deep in their chest: do not forget what you witnessed. Then she stepped out onto the jet bridge, Ethan by her side. Reporters were already waiting. Someone had called ahead. A whisper turned into a shout, and now microphones and cameras clustered like moths to flame. Questions flew, voices collided. Ms. Carter, what happened on that plane, Mr. Cole? Is Liberty Air going to respond? Do you plan to press charges? Naomi kept walking, her chin lifted, her expression calm. She did not flinch from the cameras, nor did she answer. Tonight was not about feeding sound bites. Tonight was about holding on to her dignity. Ethan shielded her as best he could, his own authority radiating as he moved them through the crowd. The flashbulbs reflected in his eyes, but his focus never wavered from Naomi. Inside the cabin, passengers filed out slowly, many casting final looks at Linda. Some shook their heads, others muttered under their breath. Rachel lingered at the door, watching Naomi disappear into the chaos of the terminal. She whispered to herself, "I'll do better next time." Linda finally stood, her legs weak beneath her. She gathered her jacket and stepped into the aisle, but the respect she had once commanded was gone. No one moved aside for her. No one offered her a nod of acknowledgement. She walked alone, the path to the door heavier than any flight she had ever worked. Arthur Lane was among the last to leave. He paused briefly at Linda's side, his eyes sharp but calm. "You'll remember this night for the rest of your life," he said quietly. "What you do with it will decide who you are." Then he walked away, leaving her standing in silence. In the terminal, Naomi and Ethan made their way through the flood of voices until they reached a quieter space. Naomi finally stopped, pulling her hand from Ethan's, turning to face him fully. Her eyes shimmered with exhaustion, but also with resolve. "You know this isn't over," she said softly. "I know," Ethan replied, "and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Together. Arthur caught up to them, his briefcase in hand. "When you're ready, call me. The world will want answers, but more importantly, it deserves the truth." Naomi met his gaze and gave the faintest smile. "I'll be in touch." As the three of them stood there, the terminal buzzing around them, Naomi felt the weight of the night settle into something deeper. Pain. Yes, exhaustion. Absolutely. But beneath it all, strength. She had endured humiliation, but she had not been broken. She had walked through the storm, and now she stood taller because of it. For Linda, the night ended in shadows, her career unraveling before her. For Rachel, it was a night of reckoning, a vow to never be silent again. For Arthur, it was another fight waiting to be fought. For Ethan, it was a line he would never regret crossing. And for Naomi, it was proof that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken away. The storm of Flight 417 would not be forgotten. When the cabin door opened that night, passengers didn't just leave a flight, they carried with them the memory of injustice laid bare. Naomi Carter walked off with her dignity intact, but also with the heavy truth that prejudice still stains the skies we all share. Ethan Cole stood beside her, proving that love and courage have no price too high. Rachel Kim chose to change, to never remain silent again, and Linda Graves was left facing the ruins of choices made in bitterness. But beyond names and faces, this story is about us. How many times have we looked away? How many times have we allowed silence to be louder than justice? Flight 417 reminds us that the fight for respect doesn't always happen in courts or streets. It can happen at 37,000 feet, in the cramped aisle of a plane, in the courage of one voice refusing to be erased. As you reflect on this journey, hold close the truth that dignity belongs to everyone. Let it stir compassion, let it spark change, and let it remind us to confront prejudice wherever it hides. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. More stories await, stories that will make you feel, question, and remember.